Welcome to Permission to Breathe, a transformative podcast dedicated to providing a safe space where you can inhale deeply and exhale freely while embracing your grief journey unapologetically. I am your host, Dr. Tammy Isaac, a spiritual practitioner, grief advocate and educator, author, and your guide on this journey through grief. This space was born out of the understanding that grief is not just an event, it's a lifelong unfolding. It's layered, it's complex, and often it's silence. And here is where we disrupt the silence. We will talk about the grief that lingers after the food stops arriving at your door, the grief that remains when no one calls and no one comes by to check on you. The grief that's complicated, the grief that's ancestral, the grief that lives in your body long before it ever reaches your tears. Every episode, we honor the humanity of grief, the anger, the confusion, the numbness, the longing, and we do so without apology. Whether you're navigating fresh loss, unspoken sorrow, or the weight of a world that just won't pause, this podcast invites you to sit down, breathe deeply, and give yourself the permission you've been waiting for to grieve, to feel, to breathe. Let's begin. Today's episode is sponsored by Let the Church Grieve by Dr. Tammy Isaac, a compelling book that explores the often overlooked subject of grief within spiritual communities. Dr. Isaac combines personal antidotes with theological insights, providing a compassionate framework for understanding and addressing grief collectively. This book emphasizes the need for spiritual leaders to create safe spaces for mourning and guides congregations through the grieving process with faith and empathy. It's a must-read for anyone looking to support those experiencing grief within their spiritual communities. Grab your copy of Let the Church Grieve at www.drtammyisaac.com today and begin the journey towards healing and growth. Black History Month is often loud in the best ways. It's bold and brilliant. It's banners and documentaries. It's quotes from leaders. It's timelines of triumph. It's celebration. And of course, it should be. But what if I told you there is another layer of Black history that rarely makes the flyers? A quieter layer, a layer that lives in the body, in the blood pressure, in the way we brace ourselves walking into certain rooms, in the way we say, I'm good, even when we're not. What if part of Black history is not only what we've accomplished, but what we are carrying or have carried? Because alongside the innovation and the leadership and the cultural genius is something else that does not get a month, and that's grief. Not just personal grief, not just grief of losing someone we love, but collective grief, generational grief, the kind that did not get time off, the kind that had to clock in the next morning, the kind that kept marching, kept singing, kept praying, kept building. Black history is not only a story of survival, it is also a story of what survival cost. And today, I want to sit with that cost. I want to talk about the inherited weight carried by Black people, the emotional labor passed down without conversation, the silence that protected us, the strength that sustained us, and the stress that shaped our bodies and our health. If you have ever felt tired in a way that sleep did not fix, if you have ever felt like you were carrying more than your own story, if you have ever been praised for being strong while quietly feeling overwhelmed, this conversation is for you, because survival kept us alive, but it did not always give us space to grieve. And what is not processed doesn't just disappear, but it settles. So today, let's talk about what's settled. Let's talk about what we inherited. And let's talk about how healing can begin even here. So let's begin by taking a deep breath. And let's dive in. When we think about Black History Month, we think about greatness. We think about inventors. We think about movements. We think about music that shaped the world. We even think about leaders who stood when it was dangerous to stand. And we think about brilliance that could not be buried. And we should, because there is glory in our story. But every time we highlight achievement, I want us to gently ask another question. What did it cost? Because behind every milestone was pressure. Behind every breakthrough was resistance. Behind every first was someone navigating spaces that did not want them there. And pressure leaves a mark. Now, we talk about strength in the Black community like it's this badge of honor. We say stuff like, we come from strong people, or we know how to survive, or we've been through worse. And all of that is true, but strength is often forged in environments of chronic stress. And when stress is constant, the nervous system does not fully rest. The body stays on alert. The mind scans for threats. The heart works harder. That vigilance did not begin with us. It is rooted in centuries of forced labor, displacement, segregation, discrimination, economic exclusion, and the daily negotiations required just to move safely through hostile systems. Now imagine generations of people who had to regulate their facial expressions to stay safe, who had to swallow their anger to survive, and who had to keep working through grief because stopping was not an option. What about those who buried loved ones without justice and then returned to fields and factories, classrooms, and kitchens the very next day? Where did their grief go? It did not evaporate. It folded itself into culture, into parenting styles, into sayings like, don't let them see you sweat, into humor that masks pain, into work ethics that never rest, and into faith that holds everything because there was nowhere else to put it. Glory and grief grew side by side. And many of us inherited both. We inherited pride, we inherited brilliance, we inherited rhythm and faith and creativity. But we also inherited hypervigilance. We inherited silence around emotion, and we inherited the expectation to endure. If you have ever felt like you are always bracing for something, if you have ever walked into a room and immediately scanned it, if you have ever felt the pressure to outperform, over-deliver, or overprove, that is not just your personality. That has history. And naming that history does not diminish our pride. It gives context to our exhaustion. Black History Month allows us to celebrate the visible triumphs. And this conversation is an invitation for us to acknowledge the invisible toll, because the grief behind the glory is not weakness. It is evidence of what it took for us to survive. And survival, while powerful, is not the same as peace. If survival was necessary, silence often became strategy. There were generations of Black people who could not afford emotional expression. Crying in the wrong space could be used against you. Anger could cost you your job. Fear could be exploited, and grief could be perceived as weakness. So composure became protection. Control became discipline. Emotional restraint became maturity. And faith became the container for everything that could not be safely spoken. And over time, silence stopped feeling like strategy, and it started feeling more like identity. Many of us were raised with messages that sounded like strength, but were really survival codes. Messages like handle it, be strong, don't break, keep going, or pray and move on. And in those messages, there was wisdom, there was faith and culture, intelligence, but there was also suppression. Because what happens when grief is never processed? When trauma is never named, when the story is told, but the emotions attached to the story is not. It doesn't disappear. It settles into the nervous system. It shapes how we attach. It influences how we parent. It informs how we love, and it determines how much vulnerability feels safe. You may not know this, may not know the full story of what your grandparents endured. You may not know the private tears your mother cried. You may not even know the humiliation that your father swallowed, but you may recognize some of the patterns, right? The pressure to succeed without complaint, the discomfort with emotional vulnerability, maybe the reflex to fix rather than to feel, and the belief that rest must be earned. Silence over time can disconnect us from our own emotional language. And when you cannot name what you feel, you cannot tend to it. So instead, you power through, you achieve, you serve, you organize, you lead, you show up, and quietly you carry. For many Black families, there was no generational modeling of therapy, no inherited language for anxiety, and no roadmap for trauma recovery. There was prayer. There was community, laughter, church, and there was resilience in the culture. But there was often no space to say, I'm not okay. And if you did say it, the response might have been, you'll be fine. We've been through worse. Just trust God. And again, not because there was no love, but because there was no template. When a people group has endured collective trauma, emotional containment can feel safer than having an outward expression. But what was once protective can become limiting. Silence may have kept previous generations alive, but it can leave this generation emotionally isolated. And that isolation shows up in ways we do not always recognize as grief. It tends to show up as anxiety in high achieving professionals. It shows up as burnout in caregivers. It shows up as hypertension, as emotional numbness, and it shows up as always being the strong one. The grief behind the glory is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, chronic, inherited, and it's normalized. And when something is normalized long enough, we stop questioning it. But this month, as we honor history, we also have permission to examine it, to ask, what did silence protect? And what is it costing us now? Because strength without expression can turn inward. And when it turns inward, the body begins to speak. If silence was strategy, the body became storage. Because emotions that are not expressed do not vanish, they just relocate. They move into muscle tensions, your sleep patterns, your digestive system. They move into your heart rhythm and into your breathing. The body keeps adapting, and for generations of Black people, adaptation has been constant. We adapt to new laws, new threats, new expectations, standards of professionalism. We adapt to new codes of speech being watched. We adapt to being doubted and to being underestimated. Adaptation becomes normal. Hyper-awareness becomes normal. Pushing through becomes normal. But the nervous system was not designed for centuries of alertness. When stress becomes chronic, cortisol remains elevated. Blood pressure rises, inflammation increases, the immune system shifts. This is not just psychological, it is physiological. And you cannot separate historical stress from present day health outcomes. Higher rates of heart disease, higher rates of hypertension, higher rates of maternal mortality, and higher rates of stress-related illnesses. These are not random. They are connected to lived reality. Imagine what it means to carry not only your personal grief, but also the ongoing stress of navigating racism, discrimination, and systemic inequity. Even when you are successful, educated, and accomplished, because stress does not erase stress. Many Black professionals know what it feels like to walk into a room and represent more than themselves, to be aware of tone and posture and be aware of how their words will be interpreted. That level of emotional labor is work. And then you go home and you are caregiver, you are parent, you are partner, you are friend, and you are community anchor. Who gets to exhale? When the body never fully feels safe, rest feels unfamiliar. Stillness feels uncomfortable. Slowing down feels irresponsible. So we stay in motion. We stay productive, we stay strong, and sometimes we do not realize that fatigue we feel is not just from today. It is cumulative. It's layered, it's inherited, and it's historical. And this is not about blaming history. It is about understanding the context. Because when you understand context, you stop personalizing everything. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? And you begin asking, what have I been carrying? Because there is a difference in the two questions. When we talk about grief, we often talk about funerals, but grief is also the sorrow of living inside systems that wound. Grief is loss of safety, loss of ease, and it is the loss of being able to simply exist without calculation. And that kind of grief rarely gets acknowledged. It's quiet. It is normalized. It is often spiritualized and dismissed. But the body does not dismiss it. The body records it. And if we do not create intentional spaces to process inherited stress and collective grief, the body will continue to carry what the mouth could not say. So the question becomes, what would it look like to interrupt the pattern? What would it look like to honor the glory and tend to the grief? Because survival got us here, but survival alone is not the goal anymore. When we talk about inherited weight, I want to be very clear about something. This is not about dishonoring our ancestors. This is not about criticizing how previous generations cope. They did what they had to do. They built churches, they built businesses, they built neighborhoods, they built families, they built movements. They survived in ways that were nothing short of extraordinary. But surviving and healing are not the same thing. And what one generation did to survive, the next generation gets to evaluate. We can honor their endurance and still decide that emotional silence does not have to continue. We can celebrate their strength and still choose softness for ourselves. We can appreciate their faith and still pursue therapy. We can value their work ethic and still choose rest. We can carry their pride and still put down their pain. Healing does not ease history. It integrates it. For many of us, healing might look like learning a new emotional vocabulary. Instead of "I'm fine," saying "I'm overwhelmed." Instead of "it's nothing," say "it hurts." And instead of powering through, take a pause, take a break. Healing might even look like sitting in therapy and realizing that the anxiety you thought was just personality may be connected to inherited hypervigilance. It might look like going to the doctor and taking stress seriously. It may even look like grieving losses that were never publicly mourned. Or it could look like forgiving yourself for not being able to carry everything. It might look like redefining strength, because strength does not have to mean silent suffering. Strength can mean awareness. It can mean having boundaries, maybe asking for help and saying no. And it can mean crying and not apologizing for it. Black history can still be celebrated, but perhaps this year's celebration can also include reflection. Reflecting on what we have carried, reflection on what we want to keep, and reflection on what we are ready to release. If you are listening and you feel something stirring, I want you to pay attention to that. That stirring may be grief asking to be acknowledged. It may be fatigue asking for rest, and it may be your body asking for gentleness. And know that you are not weak for feeling it. You are not ungrateful for needing more than survival. You're human. And maybe this generation gets to write a new chapter, a chapter where achievement and emotional health can exist together, where faith and therapy coexist, where ambition and rest also coexist, and a chapter where we do not have to earn the right to breathe. If you take nothing else from all that I've shared, I want you to take this, that know that you are allowed to honor history without being crushed by it. Some of what you carry did not begin with you. Okay? But awareness can begin with you. And awareness is not accusation, but it is an invitation to loosen your grip, to check your heart, your body, and your breath. And it's an invitation just to ask yourself gently, what am I still holding, and what am I ready to lay down? This is not about abandoning strength, but it is about expanding it. Because the truest strength may not be in how much we can endure. It may be in how honestly we can heal. So I want you to take a deep breath and know that you do not have to carry it all alone. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Permission to Breathe podcast. I want to invite you to sit with it just a little bit longer. Notice what came up, notice what feels heavy and what feels clear, and know that there is no rush to resolve any of it. You can also read the companion blog to this episode found on my website at www.drtammyisaac.com, along with the show notes. If this conversation was helpful, you are welcome to share it with someone who may need it, or leave a review so others can find their way here. and join me next Monday for a new episode of the Permission to Breathe podcast. And as always, take care of yourself gently. And until next time, give yourself permission to breathe.